Edward the Confessor was the last Anglo-Saxon king of the House of Wessex, growing up during the most turbulent time in English history. As the seventh son of King Aethelred the Unready, he was never meant to assume the throne. However, the Viking conquest of England and the vanquishing of his family would leave him as one of the only remaining heirs to the bloodline of the House of Wessex, the first kings of all England. This is the tragic story of Edward the Confessor, a man who would restore his house to power, but in his long and politically weak rule, he would set in motion one of the most defining events in English history, the Norman invasion, and the ultimate demise of Anglo-Saxon culture. This is his story. Edward was born in the year 1003 and was the seventh son of King Aethelred the Unready by his second wife, Emma of Normandy. As the youngest of Aethelred's children, Edward had little expectation of ever ascending to the throne. He grew up in the wealth and privilege of his father's Anglo-Saxon court, sheltered from the turbulent world outside. Yet, during his formative years, England was increasingly targeted by fearsome Viking invasions, led by Sweyn Forkbeard, the King of Denmark and Norway, as well as the Jomsvikings under Thorkel the Tall. These Viking forces raided and plundered the kingdom relentlessly, leaving devastation in their wake. Aethelred, unable to unite his kingdom's fractured armies, saw his reign falter. In the year 1013, the Vikings overran the kingdom, and Sweyn Forkbeard claimed the English throne. At just 10 years old, Edward was forced into exile in Normandy, a land that had become a temporary refuge for the displaced Anglo-Saxon royal family. With Sweyn now crowned king, Edward, once a privileged young prince, was reduced to a mere boy in exile, his father a king without a throne. However, destiny was to offer a brief reprieve. Sweyn's reign proved to be short and fleeting. He died after only 5 weeks on the throne, at around 50 years of age. With the legendary Viking king's death, the Anglo-Saxon nobles, eager to restore their own, invited Aethelred back to England. The throne was reclaimed, and Edward once again saw hope on the horizon. Yet, after just 3 years of rule, Aethelred passed away, and with his death, England was thrust once more into turmoil. Sweyn's son Cnut launched another invasion, determined to complete what his father had started. In the wake of Aethelred's death, Edward's half-brother Edmund Ironside was crowned the King of England. Edmund would carry the torch of resistance, fighting fiercely against Cnut's Viking forces in a series of brutal and bloody battles that became legendary in English history. Scandinavian accounts even suggest that Edward, though no older than 13 years old, fought alongside Edmund on the battlefield, though this claim remains disputed by historians. Ultimately, the conflict between Edmund and Cnut would reach a grim conclusion. The two men agreed to divide the kingdom between them, sharing the title of co-kings. After enduring several grueling battles, Edmund either succumbed to his wounds or was murdered, leaving Cnut as the undisputed ruler of England. Once again, Edward was exiled. This time, the kingdom was entirely in the hands of the Vikings. The reign of Wessex was extinguished, and with it, Edward's hopes of reclaiming his birthright. His mother, Emma of Normandy, had remarried Cnut, the very man who had claimed their homeland, and together, they ruled England while Edward remained in obscurity in Normandy. In the same year, Cnut ordered the execution of Edward's last surviving older half-brother, Eadwig, further deepening the wounds that had long plagued Edward. The relentless tragedies of Edward's youth, the death of his family, the destruction of his house, and the perceived betrayal of his mother would leave a mark on his soul. These events, filled with sorrow and loss, no doubt shaped Edward into a bitter and angry man. In his later years, he became notorious for his violent temper and fits of rage, a reflection of the deep-seated pain and grief that had festered within him throughout his life. His early years of turmoil, marked by Viking invasions, exile, and the obliteration of his family's legacy, left a man fractured by the harshness of fate. Edward spent much of his life in the Norman court. His mother, Emma of Normandy, had remarried Cnut the Great, the most powerful Viking king of his time, and together they had 2 children, a son named Harthacnut and a daughter named Gunhilda. Emma's marriage to Cnut was said to be one of genuine affection and love, in stark contrast to her first marriage to Aethelred the Unready, which had been motivated solely by political necessity. Cnut, a king of extraordinary ability and ambition, rose to dominate not just England, but also Denmark and Norway, establishing the North Sea Empire. As Cnut's reign flourished, so too did Emma's status. Cnut's remarkable achievements as the most powerful Viking king to ever live earned him unparalleled glory, and Emma, as his queen, shared in this newfound prestige. Her children by Cnut, especially Harthacnut, who was groomed to take over the thrones of both England and Denmark, became her closest concern. Meanwhile, Edward remained in the shadows, tucked away in Normandy, far from the grandeur of his mother's new life. He was, for all intents and purposes, forgotten, an afterthought in the court of his mother's new family. It is unclear whether Emma made any effort to visit her exiled son during this time, but the absence of such acts, coupled with her evident favour towards her children with Cnut, would have undoubtedly stung Edward deeply. As Edward grew older, his bitterness toward his mother would only deepen. His perception of Emma in his later years was clouded by a sense of resentment, as he felt abandoned by the woman who, once his protector, had now turned her affection towards her new family. In her pursuit of power and the future of her son Harthacnut, Emma's neglect of Edward left him isolated, a forgotten prince in a foreign land. Cnut would rule in England from the years 1016 until his death in the year 1035. Edward would have been around 32 years old when the news reached Normandy on the death of the mighty Cnut. Edward and his brother Alfred Atheling would come up with a plan to launch an expedition into England with an army of Norman mercenaries. They sought to take back their ancestral home and restore England to the rule of the House of Wessex. However, Cnut's eldest son from his first marriage, named Harald Harefoot, would argue that he should be the next King of England. He was Cnut's eldest son, and his mother was Elfgifu of Northampton, a noblewoman from Northumbria. Several northern nobles would rally to his side. Godwin, the Earl of Wessex, a man who Cnut had elevated to power, was in favour of Harthacnut's ascension, as was Emma of Normandy, but the Witan argued that they immediately needed a regent until Harthacnut came to claim the throne. Thus, Harald Harefoot was named as England's regent, and in the words of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Harthacnut was forsaken because he was too long in Denmark. Thus, Harald was crowned as the new King of England, to which the Witan agreed. But Harald, driven by ambition, soon seized the treasures of his father Cnut the Great, stripping Emma of Normandy of her wealth and power. Tensions in England would rise, and Godwin found himself compelled to switch sides. William of Malmesbury records that Harald, growing in strength and numbers, overwhelmed Godwin's position. Edward and his brother Alfred Atheling did not care for English politics, and they set foot on English soil with a retinue of hardened Norman mercenaries. Their purpose was clear and unwavering: to seize the throne and restore the ancient House of Wessex. However, several theories remain of the true motivation behind their daring expedition. Were the two princes spurred on by their mother, Emma of Normandy, to reclaim the crown? Or did they act on their own accord, driven by the blood of kings that coursed through their veins? Emma's Iconium claims the usurper devised a wicked plan with his allies, intending to kill Emma's children, so that he could secure his reign and continue living in his sins. He came up with a deceitful trick, crafting a letter as if it were from the Queen herself, addressed to her sons who were living in Normandy. The letter read, "Emma, Queen in name only, sends motherly greetings to her sons Edward and Alfred. My dear sons, as we mourn the death of our Lord, the King, I am deeply concerned about your future. Each day you are being pushed further away from your rightful kingdom. I wonder what you plan to do, knowing that your delay only strengthens the usurper's hold on the throne. He travels through towns and cities, making allies through gifts, threats, and promises. Yet, the people would rather have one of you as their ruler than remain under his control. I urge one of you to come to me quickly and in secret, so that I can offer you wise counsel and explain how to reclaim your inheritance. Please send word back to me with the messenger about what you decide. Farewell, my beloved sons." Many historians hold that Harold Harefoot, in his cunning, likely had the letter forged in order to deceive his rivals. According to the Iconium, Alfred and Edward read the letter and, in their innocence, believed the fabrication. They unwisely replied to their parent that one of them would come to her. William of Jumièges recounts that in the year 1036, Edward would launch a daring raid on Southampton. He won a decisive victory against the city's defenders and returned to Normandy, his ships heavy with spoils. Yet, this rapid retreat revealed a crucial truth. Edward lacked the strength and numbers needed to truly challenge Harold. His brother Alfred, however, was bolder still. With his Norman retinue, he ventured deep into England, reaching the ancient city of Winchester. But the winds of power had shifted against him, with Emma's influence waning, and Godwin, the mighty Earl of Wessex, now the true power in the south. Alfred's advance was quickly intercepted. Godwin, ever the calculating figure, swore to protect the young Atheling. Yet, loyalty in such turbulent times was a fleeting thing. According to some sources, Godwin, sensing the change in fortune, betrayed Alfred and delivered him into the hands of Harold Harefoot. Harold ordered the Norman mercenaries accompanying Alfred to be slaughtered. Alfred himself was seized and brought before the king, and in a cruel act of retribution, Harold decreed that Alfred be sent to a monastery, only to be blinded, a punishment so severe that it led to the young prince's death. Alfred's death would haunt Edward for the remainder of his life. The brother he had grown up with in exile had been slain, and due to this he would never fully trust Earl Godwin. Harold Harefoot ruled England for roughly 5 years, until his death in the year 1040. During this period, Emma of Normandy fled to the court of her son Harthacnut, where the two began plotting an invasion of England. After Harold's death, Harthacnut was invited to return to England and claim the throne. By this time, he had already established himself as the King of Denmark, and now he was to rule over both England and Denmark. In the year 1041, Harthacnut invited his half-brother Edward to return from his long exile in Normandy. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Edward was sworn in as king, a gesture that likely granted him a small degree of power and positioned him as Harthacnut's heir, as the latter had no wife or children. There are various theories as to why Harthacnut invited Edward back. Some suggest that Emma of Normandy, his mother, may have influenced the decision, while others speculate that Harthacnut, who was reportedly in poor health, was preparing for the future of his kingdom, although there is no evidence of this. Another possibility is that the leading nobles and magnates, disillusioned by Harthacnut's harsh rule, may have pressured him into the decision. Despite the reasons being unclear, after 25 years in exile, Edward was finally brought back to England at around the age of 38. He returned to the land of his birth, a place where his family had once been all-powerful. In the year 1042, Harthacnut attended a wedding in Lambeth, a notable event in Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Scandinavian society. The groom, Tovy the Proud, was a wealthy and influential Danish then, and the bride, Geitha, was the daughter of Osgod Clapper, a major landowner in East Anglia. The celebration was in full swing, the hall alive with music. Harthacnut raised his goblet to toast the union. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Harthacnut died as he stood at his drink, and he suddenly fell to the earth with an awful convulsion, and those who were close by took hold of him, and he spoke no word afterwards. The king had been poisoned. The moment his cup was drained, his fate was sealed, and in an instant he was writhing on the ground, and despite the efforts of those nearby, he never uttered another word. Speculation ran rampant. However, the culprit of this treacherous act remains a mystery. Whispers pointed to Edward the Confessor, Harthacnut's half-brother, and the last surviving son of Aethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy. Edward stood to gain the throne, his ambition perhaps masked by a guise of piety. Yet, some eyes turned towards Earl Godwin, a man whose cunning matched his power. His role in orchestrating the poison was plausible, given his rare rise to power and his deep connection to other English nobles. Nevertheless, the true identity of Harthacnut's murderer has been swallowed by the sands of time, a secret so well kept, it evades even the most diligent of historians. The death of Harthacnut marked a pivotal moment in English history, the end of Cnut the Great's dynasty and line, and the restoration of the House of Wessex. After the sudden death of Harthacnut, England found itself at a crossroads. The Witan, the assembly of the kingdom's most powerful nobles, convened to decide the future of the throne. The lingering Danish claims from the Viking era weighed heavily on their deliberations. Amidst this uncertainty, one figure would shift the balance: Godwin, the most powerful of the English earls. Godwin, a master of political strategy, saw an opportunity to guide the kingdom's fate. In councils and great halls, Godwin argued forcefully for an English king to restore native rule, appealing to a sense of shared identity and unity, free from foreign domination. Slowly, his persuasive arguments won over the nobles. Edward's noble lineage, rooted in both the ancient English and Norman bloodlines, emerged as the unifying symbol the kingdom needed. When the moment came, the Witan chose Edward to ascend the throne. Godwin's political manoeuvring not only secured Edward's kingship, but also solidified his legacy as a kingmaker, whose influence would shape the future of England. Thus, England embarked on a new chapter, guided by the steady hand of Godwin and the reign of Edward the Confessor. Godwin was the most experienced political player in the kingdom, and was by far the richest. This would foreshadow the later clashes between the inexperienced king and the formidable earl. When Edward ascended to the throne, his position was precarious. The period of Viking rule had eroded loyalty to the ancient House of Wessex, leaving him dependent on the support of the kingdom's three most powerful earls to maintain control: Siward of Northumbria, Leofric of Mercia, and Godwin of Wessex. Among these influential men, it was Godwin who held the most power and commanded the greatest respect. In addition, although the wealth of Edward's lands exceeded that of the greatest earls, he had no real power base, and it seems that he did not attempt to build one until he received a letter from Magnus the Good, the King of Norway and Denmark. According to the Norse King saga, Magnus sent envoys to England with a message for King Edward the Confessor. The letter, sealed with Magnus's authority, greeted Edward and then declared, "You must have heard of the agreement between me and Harthacnut, and that the survivor of us two would inherit all the lands and people of the other. Now Harthacnut is dead, and I have taken possession of Denmark as my rightful inheritance. Before he died, Harthacnut ruled both Denmark and England, so by our agreement, I now claim England as well. I request that you hand over the kingdom to me. If not, I will come with the force of Denmark and Norway to claim it by arms, and fate will decide who shall rule." When King Edward read the letter, he replied firmly, "It is well known to all men in this country that my father, King Aethelred, was the rightful heir to this kingdom by both the old and new laws of inheritance. After his death, my brother Edmund became king as the eldest, and I accepted that. Then after Edmund, my stepfather Cnut the Great took the throne, and while he lived, there was no opportunity for anyone else to claim it. After Cnut, Harald ruled, and then Harthacnut, who held both England and Denmark, believing it was fair that he should have both, while I have none. But when Harthacnut died, the people of England chose me as their king. I have taken on this title and been consecrated as king, and I have established my authority just as my father did before me. As long as I live, I will not give up my crown. If King Magnus comes with an army, I will not raise one against him. He will only take England when he takes my life." King Magnus had the repute of a warrior and a wise king, and was the king of both Denmark and Norway. An invasion may have resulted in England's capitulation and Edward's death. Fearing invasion, Edward took command of the fleet at Sandwich. However, Magnus never invaded and died young in the year 1047, aged just 23. In the year 1043, with the steadfast support of England's most powerful earls, Edward took a decisive and ruthless step to consolidate his authority by turning against his own mother. Edward's fury was directed squarely at the woman who had abandoned him for a quarter of a century, leaving him exiled in Normandy. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Edward, in an act of profound betrayal, ordered the confiscation of all of his mother's lands, along with her vast riches in gold and silver, and other untold treasures. Known for his fits of rage, this act of cruelty may have been driven by a sudden outburst of anger. To seize his own mother's personal wealth was indeed an extraordinary decision, one that might seem illogical, even incomprehensible. Yet, in the context of Edward's tumultuous youth and the deep wounds left by his abandonment, the actions appear less than strange. They reflect the complex and painful relationship between a son who had suffered betrayal and a king determined to assert his dominance, no matter the cost. The Latin biography of King Edward stated, "He was a very proper figure of a man, of outstanding height, and distinguished by his milky white hair and beard, full face and rosy cheeks, thin white hands, and long translucent fingers. In all the rest of his body he was an unblemished royal person, pleasant but always dignified. He walked with eyes downcast, most graciously affable to one and all. If some cause aroused his temper, he seemed as terrible as a lion, but he never revealed his anger by railing." This depiction of Edward appears to be quite fitting, capturing both his melancholic nature, reflected in his downcast eyes, and his fiery temper, comparing him to that of a lion, an accurate comparison to his volatile and fierce personality, shaped by a life of tragedy. The alliance between Edward and Godwin reached its height in the year 1045, with Edward's marriage to Godwin's daughter Edith. This union was not just a matrimonial bond, but an alliance, sealing Godwin's position as the king's foremost advisor and confidant. During this time, Godwin provided counsel and guidance to Edward, helping him navigate the complexities of ruling a diverse and often turbulent kingdom. From humble beginnings, Godwin had forged a noble house, and it was also the most powerful one in the kingdom. He ruled over Wessex, the richest land in the realm. The Godwin family now held 3 earldoms, as he convinced Edward to grant his son Harald the earldom of East Anglia, and his eldest swain southern Mercia. Only northern Mercia and Northumbria remained in other hands. In addition, with Edith as queen, the Godwin family's influence infiltrated every corner of the kingdom. Moreover, Edward, having only recently returned to England as a half-Norman stranger with no experience in English politics or any kind of leadership, a struggle for power would now begin between the formidable Earl and the inexperienced king. It was said that Godwin, more than any other, held the reins of the kingdom. King Edward seemed content to let Godwin and his formidable house manage the kingdom, a task they performed with notable fairness and skill. This arrangement allowed Edward to indulge his own interests, many of which were rooted in his years spent in Normandy. Among his closest friends was Count Eustace of Boulogne. One fateful day, after visiting the king, Eustace and his retinue set off to return to Normandy, passing through Dover on their way. The Normans, brimming with entitlement, rode into the town and demanded accommodation. A local householder, wearied of these armed foreigners, refused them entry. In retaliation, the Normans attacked, wounding the householder and sparking a violent confrontation. A brawl quickly escalated, resulting in nearly 40 deaths, with many Normans among the casualties. Enraged, Count Eustace hurried back to his friend King Edward, demanding retribution for the affront. The king, incensed that his close friend had been attacked, immediately summoned Godwin, insisting that the town, situated within Godwin's earldom, be harshly punished. Godwin, ever the voice of reason, responded that the king's justice could not be carried out without a proper hearing of the case. This measured reply only fueled Edward's anger, and in a rare episode, Edward would fly into an infamous blind rage, rendering him impervious to reason. Egged on by his Norman advisors, Edward blamed Godwin for the murder of his brother Alfred, a charge the Witan had already acquitted him of. This renewed accusation, despite Godwin's previous exoneration, intensified the tension between the king and his most powerful earl, setting the stage for a dramatic confrontation. In this volatile atmosphere, the kingdom was on the brink of chaos. Godwin, the most powerful man in England, knew he was no longer welcome at court. King Edward, consumed by rage and resentment, had grown weary of the Godwin family's dominance, aware that they were the true rulers of England. Faced with the king's blind fury and baseless accusations, Godwin swiftly took action. Summoning his sons, he issued a command to gather an army. He would rally the men of Wessex, while Harald would muster the forces of East Anglia. His other sons too were dispatched to gather loyal followers from across the land, each corner of the kingdom responding to the call of the House of Godwin. Meanwhile, Edward fortified his own position, rallying his own supporters. By his side stood the Normans, skilled in battle and renowned for their armour. In addition, Edward secured the alliance of the English Earls Leofric of Mercia and Siward of Northumbria. These earls, perhaps eager to see their rival of the House of Godwin humbled, pledged their support to the king. The men of Wessex, hardened by years of service under their earl, readied themselves for battle. King Edward was soon informed that Godwin and his armed host were on the move. The formidable earl, undeterred by the king's wrath, demanded a chance to refute the charges of Alfred's murder and sought to bring Eustace to trial for the violence in Dover. Edward, sensing the gravity of the situation, stalled for time and summoned the northern earls. The cry of treason echoed through the court, and the response was swift. The northern earls, accompanied by their shire feuds, marched south, ready to confront Godwin. The stage was set for civil war, and a crucial meeting was arranged to take place in London to resolve the crisis. As Godwin's army approached the capital, they found themselves face to face with their king. Despite their loyalty to Godwin, the sight of Edward, their sovereign, caused hesitation among the ranks. Fearful of the repercussions, land confiscations, and the wrath of the church, many of Godwin's troops began to disband. Seizing the moment, Edward declared that Godwin and his son Harald present themselves before the throne. Godwin, wary of a trap, sought assurances for his safety, but Edward remained adamant, offering none. Cornered and outmaneuvered, Godwin faced an impossible choice: surrender and risk his life, or stand firm and plunge the realm into war. Realizing the futility of resistance, Godwin prepared for exile. By early October, Godwin and his sons were declared outlaws and were given 5 days to leave England. The men of Dover who had sparked the initial conflict went unpunished. Godwin, accompanied by his wife Geitha and their sons Tostig and Gurth, fled to Flanders. Harald and Leofwine would set sail for the Norse stronghold of Dublin, seeking refuge among the Viking warriors. Meanwhile, Godwin's daughter Edith, the Queen, was sent to a nunnery and stripped of all her royal possessions, a stark reminder of the king's absolute authority. Thus, the once mighty house of Godwin was scattered, their power broken, their influence diminished. Edward's calculated move had not only neutralized his greatest rival, but also reaffirmed his control over the kingdom. The shadow of Godwin's ambition faded, leaving Edward to rule unchallenged, his throne secure, for now. It couldn't last. Word of the king's ruthless actions spread like wildfire, igniting a wave of dissent across the kingdom. Public opinion swelled against Edward, fueled by the common folk's outrage. The Englishmen, denied the two fundamental rights they cherished above all else, the right to live in peace in their homes and the protection of the law, found their patience wearing thin. The people revered Godwin, remembering him as the steadfast earl who had championed peace and fairness for decades. Under his stewardship, the kingdom had thrived, and justice had been accessible to all. In stark contrast, King Edward, enslaved by the influence of his Norman allies, appeared indifferent to his own subjects' needs. He favoured the interests of his Norman friends over the welfare of the English people, a betrayal that did not go unnoticed. The tales of Edward's betrayal resonated through villages and towns, stirring a collective memory of better days under Godwin's rule. Murmurs of discontent grew louder, evolving into cries for justice. They could no longer tolerate a king who had turned his back on them, prioritizing foreign interests and forsaking the very people he was sworn to protect. Meanwhile, in Flanders, Godwin with his vast gold hoards was amassing an army of mercenaries, intent on sailing back to England and challenging the king. In the year 1052, Godwin made a bold move, landing on the Isle of Wight to gauge the loyalty of the men of Wessex. These men, who had known Godwin as their lord for over 30 years, remembered his fair and just rule. With a sense of nostalgia and loyalty, they rallied to his side, providing support and supplies. Shortly after Godwin's triumphant return to the Isle of Wight, his sons Harald and Leofwine sailed from Dublin with 9 ships, joining their father's ever-growing host. In a desperate bid for support, Edward summoned the earls of the realm, yet the most powerful among them, Leofric of Mercia and Siward of Northumbria, sensed the shifting tides of opinion and chose not to attend. The king found himself isolated, outnumbered, and bereft of the support of the mightiest lords in England. Godwin and his sons soon made their way to London, where Godwin's reputation and charm quickly won over the Londoners. Their support swelled his ranks, adding to the formidable force that now stood against the king. Sailing under London Bridge, Godwin's forces disembarked, facing Edward's army across the Thames once more, as they had in the year 1051. The air was thick with tension, the threat of bloodshed looming. Edward, despite his willingness to fight, was swayed by his fearful counsellors, aware of Godwin's wrath and influence. A truce was brokered, and a meeting of a Witan was called to determine England's fate. The Witan, now including Leofric and Siward, gathered to deliberate. Godwin stood before the assembly, solemnly swearing an oath that he had no hand in Alfred Aetheling's death, and that his family harboured no treasonous intent. The Witan and the reluctant king accepted his oath. The Godwin family was restored to their lands and positions, a development that deeply affected the balance of power. An arrangement was made that upon Godwin's death, Harald his son would inherit the earldom of Wessex. The Witan concluded that the crisis of 1051 had been fueled by bad counsellors who had influenced the king to make disastrous decisions. Consequently, Edward's Norman favourites at court were all outlawed. Godwin had outmanoeuvred the king in a masterful display of political prowess. Edward, humbled and defeated, would never again challenge Godwin's authority. The Godwin family once again ruled over England, their influence unchallenged. However, Godwin's triumph was to be short-lived, as the tides of fate were ever unpredictable. Just a year after Godwin's triumphant return from exile in the year 1053, he suddenly died after collapsing at a royal banquet at Winchester. Contemporary accounts indicated that he had died from a sudden illness, possibly a stroke. Godwin's second son Harald succeeded him as the Earl of Wessex, while Harold's former earldom of East Anglia was bestowed upon Elfgar, the son of the Earl of Mercia. Godwin's eldest son Sweyn wasn't able to claim any titles due to his pilgrimage to Jerusalem, during which he perished in September in the year 1052 on the return journey. In the subsequent years, several earldoms fell vacant and were granted to Harold's younger brothers, further consolidating the family's power. In the year 1055, Siward, the Earl of Northumbria, died and was succeeded by Harold's younger sibling Tostig. Then in the year 1057, the Earl of Mercia passed away and was succeeded by his son Elfgar, which freed up East Anglia. A reduced form of this earldom was granted to another one of Harold's brothers, Gurth, while the counties of Essex, Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Middlesex, Surrey and Kent were amalgamated into a new earldom for another of Harold's younger brothers, Leofwine. Thus, under the reign of Edward the Confessor, the Godwin family came to dominate nearly all of England, with the exception of Mercia. By this time, King Edward was largely content to leave the effective rule of the kingdom in the capable hands of his powerful earls. The scope of Edward's power is challenged by historians. In contemporary sources such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Godwinsons would wage war on Wales and launch other military expeditions on their own initiative. It is only John of Worcester, writing almost a century later, who inserts into the Chronicle's account the phrase "at the king's command." This reflects the authority in England with the Godwinsons, and that they actually ruled the country. Once again, Edward was king in name alone. In October of the year 1065, while hunting with King Edward, Harold's brother Tostig, the Earl of Northumbria, faced a sudden rebellion in his own lands. His Thens, dissatisfied with his rule which they deemed oppressive, rose up against him, slaying 200 of his followers. They swiftly elected Morcar, the brother of Edwin of Mercia, as the new Earl. Tostig had been a favourite of both the king and queen, who insisted that the rebellion be crushed. However, despite his close ties to the royal family, neither his brother Harald nor any of his other supporters rallied to Tostig's cause. In face of this betrayal, Edward was compelled to banish Tostig from England, an action that set in motion events that would later prove catastrophic. During Edward the Confessor's 24-year reign, he remained childless with his queen Edith, sealing the end of the direct Wessex line. Yet the legacy of the House of Wessex lingered in the shadows. Edward's older brother Edmund Ironside had fathered children before his death. When he died, they were secretly sent away to Europe, likely to save them from execution. Among them was a surviving son named Edward, who would later be known to history as Edward the Exile. Upon learning that the Exile was still alive, Edward the Confessor summoned him back to England in 1056, with the hope of making him his heir. Edward the Exile represented the last hope for a smooth, undisputed succession to the Saxon royal house. The Exile, along with his wife and children, finally returned to England in the year 1057, but tragically, the Exile died just days later, on April the 19th, without ever meeting his cousin the king. This sudden death has long left historians puzzled. One prevailing theory, especially favoured by Norman historians, is that Edward always intended for William the Conqueror to succeed him. Having spent 25 years in Normandy, and being a first cousin once removed to William, a strong blood tie existed between them. It is believed that William may have visited Edward during Godwin's exile, and Edward may have promised him the throne. However, the sincerity of this promise is debated, as many historians question whether Edward ever intended to fulfill it, or if he later changed his mind. Furthermore, William had captured Harold Godwinson, the most powerful man in England, and coerced him into swearing an oath to support his claim to the English throne. Though the nature of this oath remains uncertain, it is likely that Harold was forced to swear it under duress. Edward the Exile had a son, named Edgar Atheling, who would have been 14 years old in the year 1066. Edgar, though still a child, was the last surviving male heir of the Wessex line, making him the rightful claimant to the throne according to English law, though Edward never formally appointed him as such before his death. In the year 1066, when Edward the Confessor was on his deathbed, he had still not clarified his preference for the succession. Before he died, however, he entrusted the kingdom to Harold's protection, his mightiest earl and the most formidable man in England. Edward's failure to designate a clear successor created a dangerous power vacuum. This uncertainty would eventually spark the greatest upheaval in English history, marking the end of the House of Wessex and the demise of Anglo-Saxon culture. Edward's decision to banish Tostig from England would set in motion a series of events that would dramatically reshape the kingdom's future. Tostig, once a loyal earl, was exiled after his oppressive rule in Northumbria that sparked a rebellion. With his power stripped away, Tostig sought vengeance, turning to Harald Hardrada, the legendary Viking king of Norway, to assist him in reclaiming his title. Hardrada was a fearsome warrior with a reputation as one of the most formidable kings in Viking history, and he answered Tostig's call, bringing with him a powerful fleet to invade England. In September of the year 1066, Hardrada's forces met the English army at the Battle of Fulford, where they decisively defeated the forces of the Northern Earls. However, his triumph would be short-lived. Only 5 days later, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold Godwinson, the new English king, faced Hardrada's army in a battle that would become legendary. Despite Hardrada's prowess, Harold's forces managed to secure a crushing victory, ending the Viking threat in England. Yet this victory was bittersweet, as Harold's army, exhausted from the fierce battle, now faced another invasion from the south. While Harold celebrated his triumph at Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy, who had long harboured aspirations for the English throne, was preparing to cross the Channel. With his army of Normans and allies, William landed in England in late September of 1066. The climactic Battle of Hastings soon followed, one of the most defining moments in English history. Harold, battered from his recent battle with Hardrada, met William's forces at Hastings. In a fierce struggle, Harold's army was overwhelmed, and Harold himself was killed. William's victory at Hastings marked the end of Anglo-Saxon rule in England and the dawn of the Norman conquest. William's reign was transformative. He sought to solidify his control over the land by constructing a vast network of castles and fortifications. He established a new Norman aristocracy, replacing the Anglo-Saxon nobility with his loyal followers. The traditional Anglo-Saxon way of life was slowly eroded, replaced by the customs and language of the Normans. This marked the end of an era, as Anglo-Saxon culture was gradually absorbed into the Norman world. In a twist of fate, Edward the Confessor, the man whose reign had seen England politically falter, would be canonised by the English Church in the year 1161. Edward, despite his bouts of rage and his love for hunting, became the only English monarch to be made a saint. His canonisation has been regarded by many historians as a political move, a way to elevate the sanctity of his reign, especially given the circumstances of his childless marriage to Edith. Some believe that Edith commissioned the life of the King Edward, not only to glorify her husband, but to also absolve her of any blame for the lack of heirs. In portraying Edward as a saint who renounced worldly desires, including the marriage bed, she could avoid responsibility for the failure of the English royal line. Despite this religious elevation, the legacy of Edward the Confessor is fraught with controversy. His inability to secure a clear succession and his failure to decisively act in the political landscape of England ultimately led to the downfall of the House of Wessex. Edward's reign set the stage for the Norman Conquest, a turning point in English history that forever transformed the kingdom. From a traumatized boy to a politically weak king, Edward's decisions, particularly in the years leading up to his death, contributed directly to the events that led to England's defeat at Hastings. In my view, the fall of the House of Wessex and the subsequent end of Anglo-Saxon England can be laid firmly at Edward's feet. I would like to give a huge thank you to all of my members. Your contribution is valuable to the continuation of the channel, and I appreciate you all immensely. A special thank you to John Sides. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to like, subscribe and share, and I'll see you all next week for another History Profile.